Hello everyone. I am Elaine Oclarit, and here's our continuation for our topic in chapter 11, which is developing instruments to assess personality. In developing instruments to assess personality, tools such as logic, theory, and data reduction methods such as factor analysis are frequently used in the process of developing personality tests. Another tool in the test development process may be a criterion group. As we will see, most personality tests employ two or more of these tools in the course of their development. For logic and reason, logic and reason may dictate what content is covered by the items. Logic and reasons are two items that are often used together in philosophy. The key difference between logic and reason is that logic is the systematic study of the form of arguments, whereas reason is the application of logic to understand and judge something. For example, if you were developing a true or false test of extroversion, logic and reason might dictate that one of the items be something like I consider myself an outgoing person. Indeed, the use of logic and reason in the development of test items is sometimes referred to as the content or content-oriented approach to test development. Theory. Personality measures differ in the extent to which they rely on a particular theory of personality in their development as well as their interpretation. As with the development of tests using logic and reason, research, clinical experience, and the opinions of experts might be used in the development of personality tests that is theory-based. The trait theories of personality center on the idea that personality is comprised of broad traits or dispositions. Various theories have been proposed to identify which attributes are key components in personality, as well as the attempts to determine the total number of personality tests. Data reduction methods. Data reduction methods represent another class of widely used tool in contemporary test development. Data reduction methods include several types of statistical techniques collectively known as factor analysis or cluster analysis. One of the data reduction methods in the design of personality measures is to aid in the identification of the minimum number of variables or factors that account for the intercorrelation in observed phenomena. Data reduction methods is a well-known use of such methods and was employed by Cattell in the 1940s, in which he reduced a list of more than 18,000 personality traits names to only 16 primary facts of personality. One of the methods is the Big Five. The Big Five is a measure of five major dimensions of personality and 30 facets that define each dimension. It is the most widely accepted personality theory held by psychologists today. The theory states that personality can be boiled down to five core factors known as the extroversion, neuroticism, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. The first one is the neuroticism. It is referred to as the emotional stability factor. It taps aspects of adjustment and emotional stability, including how people cope in times of emotional turmoil. And the second one is the extroversion. It taps aspects of sociability, how proactive people are in seeking out others, as well as assertiveness. And the third one is the openness. It refers to the openness to experience as well as active imagination, aesthetic sensitivity, attentiveness to inner feelings, preference for variety, intellectual curiosity, and independence judgment. The fourth one is agreeableness. It is primarily a dimension of interpersonal tendencies that include altruism, sympathy toward others, friendliness, and the belief that others are similarly inclined. And the last one is conscientiousness. It is a dimension of personality that has to do with the active process of planning, organizing, and following through. For the criterion group, so criterion groups is a criterion may be defined as a standard on which a judgment or decision can be made. So with regard to scale development, a criterion group is a reference group of test takers who share specific characteristics and whose responses to test items serve as a standard according to which items will be included in or discarded from the final version of a scale. The process of using criterion group to develop test items is referred to as empirical criterion keying because the scoring of or keying of items has been demonstrated empirically to differentiate among groups of test takers. So, criterion groups is a group tested for traits its members are already known to possess. So it is usually for the purpose of demonstrating that responses to a test represent the traits they were intended to represent. So for example, is one of the example of criterion groups is a group of children with diagnosed visual disabilities may be given a visual test to assess its validity as a means of evaluating the presence of visual disabilities. So development of a test by means of empirical criterion keying may be summed up as follows. So first one is to create a large preliminary pool of test items from which the test items for the final form of the test will be selected. Second is administer the preliminary pool of items to at least two groups of people. And for group one is a criterion group composed of people known to possess the trait being measured. And for the group two, a randomly selected group of people who may or may not possess the trait being measured. For the third one, conduct an item analysis to select items indicative of membership in the criterion group. Items in the preliminary pool that discriminate between membership in the two groups in a statistically significant fashion will be retained and incorporated in the final form of the test. The fourth one is obtain a data on test performance from a standardization sample of test takers who are representative of the population from which future test takers will come. So the test performance data for group 2 members and items incorporated into the final form of the test may be used for this purpose if deemed appropriate. So the performance of group 2 members in the test will then become the standard against which future test takers will be evaluated. So after the mean performance of group 2 members on the individual items or scales of the test has been identified, the future test takers will be evaluated in terms of the extent to which their score deviate in either direction from the group 2 mean. So the clinical criterion for groups MMPI scale. So the clinical criterion groups for MMPI scale. So MMPI stands for Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory or MMPI. So it is one of the most commonly used psychological tests in the world. So it is a listing of the 10 clinical scales of the MMPI along with a description of the corresponding criterion group. Each of the diagnostic categories listed for 10 clinical scales were popular diagnostic categories in the 1930s. Members of the clinical criterion group for each scale were presumed to have met the criteria for inclusion in the category named in the scale. So as you can see, there's a scale and there's a clinical criterion group. So one of the examples is the hypochondriasis with its clinical criterion group, which is patients who showed exaggerated concerns about their physical health. For the depression, clinically depressed patients unhappy and pessimistic about their future. Hysteria, patients with conversion reactions. Psychopathic deviate, patients who had histories of delinquency in other antisocial behavior. And the fourth one is psychopathic. And fifth one is the masculinity, femininity, Minnesota draftees, airline and male homosexual college students from the University of Minnesota campus community. And the sixth one is paranoia. Patients who exhibited paranoid symptomatology such as ideas of preference, suspiciousness, delusions of persecution, and delusions of grandeur. Seventh one is the psychasthenia, anxious, obsessive compulsive, guilt-ridden, and self-doubting patients. The eighth one is schizophrenia. Patients who were diagnosed as schizophrenic, various subtypes, and the hypomania. Patients most diagnosed as manic depressive who exhibited manic symptomatology such as elevated mood, excessive activity, and easy distractibility. And the last one is the social introversion, wherein college students who had scored at the extreme test of introversion and extroversion. So as you can see, here's James Butcher, 1993, and friends. So that's Jim today. So today, better known as the senior author of the MMPI-2. They arrived as an Army infantryman at Outpost York in South Korea in 1953. Returning to civilian life, Jim tried various occupations, including salesman and private investigator. He later earned a PhD at the University of North Carolina, where he had occasion to work with W. Grant Delstorm and George Welsh as in MMPI Welsh Code. So Butcher's first teaching job was at the University of Minnesota, where he looked forward to working with Stark Hathaway and Paul Meehl. But he was disappointed to learn that Hathaway had moved on to the pursuit of psychotherapy research and typically disclaimed any expertise in the test. So Hathaway always refused to become involved in teaching people about the tests. Meehl had likewise moved on to other venues as well. So here's in table 11.4, 11.4, is the description of a sampling of MMPI-2RF scale. So the MMPI-2RF aids clinicians in the assessment of mental disorders, identification of specific problem areas, and treatment planning in a variety of settings. So also the test can be used to help assess major symptoms of psychopathology, personality characteristics, and behavioral proclivities. So in the clinical scales group, there are a total of 9 clinical scales. The RCD, RC1, RC2, and RC3 scales were introduced by Delagen et al. 2003, gone from the original MMPI and MMPI-2 clinical scales in the masculinity-femininity scale. So their scale name and its scale description. For the validity scales group, there are total of 8 validity scales, which is one more validity scale than in the previous edition of the test. The added validity scale is infrequent somatic response. So under is the scale name and its scale description. And for the specific problem or SP scales group, there are a total of 20 scales that measure problems. So these SP scales are grouped as relating to internalizing, externalizing, or interpersonal issues and are subgrouped according to the clinical scale on which they shed light. So here are the scale name, such as suicidal death ideation, and the scale description, and scale description, which is respondent reports self-related suicidal thoughts or actions, and etc. Just to continue, there's 20 scales that measures problems. And here's the interest scales group. There are 2 scales that measure interest, the AAS scale and the MEC scale. AES stands for aesthetic literary interest and MEC stands for mechanical physical interest. And the Psi-5 scales group, these 5 scales are revised from MMPI-2 measures. Here's the scales names such as aggressiveness revised, psychoticism revised, discontent revised, negative emotional neuroticism revised, and Here are their scale description. So the MMPI-2, much of what has already been said about the MMPI in terms of its general structure, administration, scoring, and interpretation is applicable to the MMPI-2. The most significant difference between the two tests is the more representative standardization sample or normal control group used in the norming of the MMPI-2. So the MMPI-2 is a 567 item. It is a true or false self-report measure of a person's psychological state. It has 9 validity scales or lie scales, assessing for lying, defensiveness, faking good, and faking bad, and among others. The MMPI-2RF, it is the need to rework the clinical scales of the MMPI-2 was perceived by Telegen et al. 2003 as arising, at least in part, from two basic problems with the structure of the scales. One basic problem was overlapping items. The method of test development initially used to create the MMPI, empirical criterion keying, practically ensured there would be some item overlap. So the MMPI-2RF, provides accurate measurement of 40-dimensional constructs related to personality and psychopathology with an additional 9 scales, wherein it measuring protocol validity or the individual's test-taking approach. The MMPI-2RF also aids clinicians in the assessment of mental disorders, identification of specific problem areas, and treatment planning in a variety of settings. MMPI-A, although its developers had recommended the original MMPI for use with adolescents, test users had evinced skepticism of this recommendation through the years. Early on, it was noticed that adolescents as a group tended to score somewhat higher on the clinical scales than adults. A finding that left adolescents as a group in an enviable position of appearing to suffer from more psychopathology than adults. The MMPI-A, it is an empirically based measure of adolescent psychopathology. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory Adolescent aids in problem identification, diagnosis, and treatment planning for youth. It also contains adolescent-specific scales and tailored reports for particular settings to aid in problem identification, diagnosis, and treatment planning in youth. The MMPI and its revision and progeny in perspective. The MMPI burst onto the psychology scene in the 1940s and was greeted as an innovative, well-researched, and highly appealing instrument by both clinical practitioners and academic researchers. The latest restructuring of the MMPI represents an effort not only to improve the test and bring it into the 21st century, but also to maintain continuity with the voluminous research addressing its previous form. So the MMPI revision, so the number of research studies that have conducted on this test number in the thousands and few psychological tests are better known throughout the world. So there can be a little doubt that the MMPI is very much a work in progress that will be continually patched, reconstructed, and otherwise re-innovated to maintain that continuity. So the personality assessment and culture. Every day, assessment professionals across the United States are routinely called on to evaluate personality and related variables of people from culturally and linguistically diverse populations. Yet, personality assessment is anything but routine with children, adolescents, and adults from Native American, Hispanic, Asian, African, American, and other cultures that may have been underrepresented in the development, standardization, and interpretation protocols of the measures used. What is required is a professionally trained assessor capable of conducting a meaningful assessment with sensitivity to how culture relates to the behaviors and cognitions being measured. So before any tool of personality test, personality assessment, an interview, a test, a protocol for behavioral observation, a portfolio, or something else can be employed, and before data derived from an attempt at measurement can be imbued with meaning, the assessor will ideally consider some important issues with regard to assessment of particular assessee. Acculturation and related consideration. Acculturation is an ongoing process by which an individual's thoughts, behaviors, values, worldview, so the process of acculturation begins at birth, a time at which the newborn infant's family or caretaker serves as agents of the culture. So through the process of acculturation, one develops culturally accepted ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. So here's these some published. So here are some samples questions to assess acculturation. First is describe yourself, describe your family, who lives at home, describe roles in your family, such as the role of mother, the role of father, the role of grandmother, the role of child, and so forth. So here are some additional questions. What traditions, rituals, or customs were passed down to you or by family members, and etc. So I will no longer read all of them because it's too long. Here's the additional questions. So the values are that which an individual prizes or the ideals an individual believes in. So an early systematic treatment of the subject of values came in a book entitled Types of Men by Springer 1928, which listed different types of people based on whether they value things like truth, practicality, and power. So instrumental values are guiding principles to help one attain some objective. So honesty, imagination, ambition, and cheerfulness are examples of instrumental values. Terminal values are guiding principles in a mode of behavior that is an endpoint objective. A comfortable life, an exciting life, a sense of accomplishment, and self-respect are some examples of terminal values. Identity in this context may be defined as a set of cognitive and behavioral characteristics by which individuals define themselves as members of a particular group. Stated simply, identify refers to one's sense of self. Levine and Padilla, 1980, defined identification as a process by which an individual assumes a pattern of behavior characteristic of other people, and referred to it as one of the central issues that ethnic minority groups must deal with. So, echoing this sentiment, Zuniga 1988 suggested that a question such as what do you call yourself when asked about your ethnicity might be used as an icebreaker when assessing identification. So worldview is, and the last one is worldview is the unique way people interpret and make sense of their perceptions as a consequence of their learning experiences, cultural background, and relative variables. And that would be all. Thank you. Thank you for listening.